Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and this is My Life as a Landlord. I'm so pleased that you've joined me today. You may remember my guest from episode 67, where we discussed the economic projections going into 2024. Here to talk about the post election economy. Welcome back, David Pickler. Hi.
Hello there.
So glad you're back. So it's been quite the wild ride. We're recording this post-election about post-election economy. What's your take on the market's reaction of Donald Trump getting reelected?
It's been an incredibly interesting time, Jen, because there was so much concern going into the election that we might go several days, weeks, maybe even a couple of months without having a clear answer. Were we going to have a constitutional crisis? Were we going to have a decisive victor? Were we going to start seeing chaos, rioting in the streets? I mean, there were all kinds of portents of doom and gloom, and surprising very, very many people. Probably, I would say the vast majority was the clear and decisiveness of this election. The fact that literally by about 8 or 9 o'clock at night, there was a clear path forward that Donald Trump was had done something that no one had really expected.
Right.
That despite where the polls were, that he came in and was not only getting a clear, decisive victory in the Electoral College, but the fact that he also is clearly going to be the victor in the popular vote. And there's a lot of people who are questioning, was it that Donald Trump outperformed? Was it that Kamala Harris underperformed? With the Democrats in looking back in retrospect, would they have been better served by keeping Joe Biden as their candidate? Because
Right.
clearly Kamala Harris underperformed what Biden had done in 2020. And so, as you look at what happened here, what is most interesting is that we clearly have to look at the phenomenon that is Donald Trump as truly a movement. That he has done something that has been incredibly transformative for American politics. If we think about, the historical definition of what does a Democrat look like, or what does a Republican look like, you oftentimes would say, all right, Democrats are going to be the party of the people. That's going to be the party of labor. That's going to be the party of really the middle class, and really for the working class. And so that was the party that is the Republicans would go to the big VIP dinners, the black tie affairs, and the Democrats would be just those salt of the earth, hardworking people. That was really the Democratic Party that we saw in the 1940s, in the 1950s, and certainly that was the Democratic Party of one John F. Kennedy. That is not the Democratic Party of today. And the Republican Party has basically eaten their lunch. Donald Trump has assembled a coalition of the working class, of minorities, of people who, of all backgrounds. And whereas the Democratic Party has become more the party of the cultural elite. And as a result, the message of populism, some people would argue, is Donald Trump truly a conservative? And I would argue that he may not be. But I also look back at another president in the not too far distant past who was actually attacked shortly after he was elected because it was considered that he was not enough of a conservative. And that president's name was Ronald Wilson Reagan, who is now considered to be the father of modern conservatism. But he brought his homespun version of populism and fiscal conservatism that created a whole new brand of conservatism that happened in the 1980s. Now you have Donald Trump, who is clearly a populist, clearly someone who has attracted a lot of people who've been underserved, and a lot of people who feel like they've been kind of cast aside by the current political environment. And so that's one of the reasons why that he had this great victory. Now the question is, he's been given a mandate of not only winning the presidency in a rather overwhelming fashion, but also that he's going to have a Senate that's going to have at least, and at this point, it looks like 53 Republican senators to 47 Democrat. That is
Mhm.
a very sizable working majority, one that we haven't seen in the past 40 years.
Mhm.
And at this point, it looks like he's going to have around 220 votes in the House of Representatives. So he's going to have control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. So the question is, what does he do with that mandate? We've already seen in the first couple of weeks some very interesting nominations that are going to be coming forward for various cabinet level positions and other government positions. Certainly, a few controversial ones, maybe even a few that you might even say that's a real head scratcher. Um,
Right.
but you take a look at a Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, someone who literally immediately resigned from the House of Representatives to avoid a further ethical probe, and someone who's got some questionable background. I'm not quite so sure about that Matt Gaetz appointment. There are those who were already questioning the RFK Jr. appointment as the Secretary of HHS, someone who is a noted anti-vaxxer, and he's, has talked about the impact of fluoride, in our waters. And certainly someone who's been a bit of a conspiracy theorist. So the whole RFK factor, but once again, this is the guy who came, he stopped and suspended his political campaign, his presidential campaign, to join the Trump campaign. And it's arguable that may have provided a large more measure of that victory that came in. And so when they made that announcement, I think it was Eric Trump that made the announcement, said promises made, promises kept. Now, there were a lot of promises made during this campaign.
Mhm.
Promises about cutting the corporate income tax, promises about cutting the capital gains tax, promises about eliminating taxation on things like tips and Social Security benefits. We certainly have major issues that this president's going to have to confront. We already, in the last couple of weeks, have seen issues going on with Russia and Ukraine. Whereas that may be a smoldering cauldron. Donald Trump promised to have that war resolved in 24 hours.
Yeah.
And a lot of big promises made. And we know we've become used to the fact that our politicians make these big campaign promises and no one really expects them to follow through on it, even though we vote for them because they make these promises. So as we go forward into this election, then we'll be looking at a very different set of economic, I think, structures and presumptions. Number one, I think we can expect to see a focus on, again, reducing taxation. He's talked about lowering the corporate tax rate again from 21% to 15%. That could have a profound impact on the corporate structure here. It could make it easier for corporations to have greater earnings, which could mean greater dividends. For those of your listeners, who are investing in stocks, and living off of some of those dividend income, it could be easier for companies to produce more dividend income. We're looking at capital gains tax reduction. This is great for your investors who are looking at buying those properties, and instead of paying 20 or even 23.8% capital gains rates, maybe down to only 15% or less. That could be great for capital formation. The fact that we're no longer having to worry for our small business owners. One of the things that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were both proposing was the idea that capital gains might be taxed at a person's death. This could have had profound impact on small business owners, on farmers, on people who had been taking advantage of the fact that you did get that step up upon death, and that allowed business to stay within a family. We also could be looking at a very different environment in terms of regulation. We have seen profound increases in the regulatory oversight. It's made it much more difficult for small business owners to get started. And so for many people who are trying to build, that wealth in the real estate market, to be that landlord, and if the government's making it more and more difficult for you to be able to build those businesses, then that's certainly a disincentive. A Trump 2 presidency looks to be reducing a lot of that regulatory oversight. We'll also be watching what's going on in trade, because certainly, there's already been talk about tariffs. But we need to understand the difference between rhetoric and policy.
Mm.
And Donald Trump may be able to accomplish as much just with his rhetoric, with the threat of a tariff, as he would in terms of actually enacting it. Now, we do expect that there very well could be three countries that are initially impacted by his strong talk on tariffs. One would certainly be China. China has certainly exhibited a true focus on unfair trade, trying to take advantage of the U.S. consumer and dumping a lot of their products in our market. And certainly, I see a lot of evidence towards that, where Trump might be imposed as much as a 100% trade tariff. Now, some people will say that could be inflationary. But I would
Mhm.
submit to you that we are no longer living in a 1980 world or even a 2020 world. We live in a world today that is much easier to get products from various different markets. And it can only a tariff is only inflationary if that's the only country, the only place that you can get that product. And so therefore that price increase is not a result of increased innovation or design or greater demand. It's just an increase. And so, but if now all of a sudden you can't get it from China, but you can get it from Taiwan, or you can get it from Vietnam, or you can get it from Korea, you can get it from Japan, you can get it from Australia, then maybe you don't see as much of an inflationary impact. So we're watching that very closely. And I would also submit to you that while these tariff policies may have a bit of an upsurge in terms of some prices, we also haven't talked about the impact of what his energy policies may have in terms of reducing the regulation, allowing greater drilling, allowing what could be much lower energy prices, which could have a profound beneficiary effect on our economy. Now, I mentioned that there are three countries that may be the impact of the tariffs. The first being China, the second would also be Mexico. And this could go into another policy issue, and that is immigration, the border. Clearly one of the major elements of this campaign was the border and having the appropriate immigration structure. We need to embrace the fact that America needs a good immigration policy. We need to allow those people who want to come here legally to come. From a labor perspective, from the richness of our economy, we need good immigration. What we don't need is illegal immigration. And we need a situation where people come to America because of the opportunity, not because of a paycheck. And so I certainly think that we're going to see a bit of a quid pro quo going on between tariff conversation with Mexico and the possibility of a stricter adherence to the border by Mexico. And then, of course, I'm going to throw this as a little bit of a joke. And then we have this whole issue with possible tariffs to China. I mean, with Canada. And that
Yeah.
may be more about the fact that the Canadians may seem incented to close their border because all those Democrats who want to move north. So, and it's just a joke. But no, I mean, clearly, we are looking for expansion of what's going on with development of manufacturing and of production in both Mexico, Canada, and the U.S.
Mhm.
We're still are looking at the impact of the NAFTA treaty that happened 30 years ago,
Right.
and how that's really, I think, benefited the economies of both Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. But the final thing I'll say about the election is this. At the end of the day, I think this election turned on one factor and one factor only. And that really does go back to the days of Ronald Reagan. You may
Mm.
recall, well, you're way too young to remember this, but I do remember a debate in 1980 between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. And Ronald Reagan said something that was very important. He asked the American people one question. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?
Mm.
And that came back to haunt the Democrats this year in this year's election. And because at the end of the day, this election turned on one thing, and I think one thing only, the economy. Personalities aside, because certainly, Kamala Harris was acting upon the personality of Donald Trump, calling him a fascist, comparing him to Hitler, and
Right.
and saying that he was a threat to democracy. And Donald Trump said, "It's the economy, stupid."
Mhm.
That it's about that, and I think ultimately people voted with their pocketbooks. And so now we'll be looking at an economy as we go forward that I think is going to be characterized by three or four few things. Number one, I think we will continue to see a very favorable environment for corporate earnings to grow. And at the end of the day, stocks in the stock market is a function of earnings, a profit. When
Mhm.
you buy stock, you effectively are buying an economic engine, a profit-making engine. The same way that your listeners, when they're buying a piece of real estate, that they're buying for cash flow, that they're looking at that cap rate, they're looking at that rate of return. And the greater that rate of return, the more you're willing to pay for that property. The same thing with the stock. The more profit that that company is either making now or will be making in the future, the more you're willing to pay for it. So I think that environment is going to be greatly enhanced. A second thing is that because of I think the regulatory oversight being diminished, I am looking for much more activity in the area of mergers and acquisitions. We've seen extremely little M&A activity in the U.S. stock market over the past 4 years. It's just become so difficult with a Justice Department that basically was trying to strike at any efforts to combine businesses. I certainly think we're going to see this in the banking sector. I would not be at all surprised to see a lot of those regional banks, those smaller banks, merging together to try to achieve greater economies of scale and opportunity there. And so I see that as a tremendous opportunity. I also think that we're going to be in an environment that, generally speaking, is going to be defined by lower interest rates.
Mhm.
And now we've had an interesting occurrence in the past couple of months because we've had a situation whereby in September, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates 50 basis points. The first time that they actually, had begun cutting rates after basically 22 times of raising rates over an 18-month time period, raising it from 0 to over 5.5%. They did that obviously in an effort to try to bring inflation under control. And we felt like they were on track to achieving that. So in September they cut rates 50 basis points. On the day after the election, they cut rates another 25 basis points, and I project that they very likely will cut rates again in December, another 25 basis points. But while that's been going on with the short-term rates, what's been going on with long-term rates? The
Mhm.
10-year Treasury on the date the Fed cut was at 3.6. We
Mhm.
yesterday saw the 10-year Treasury get to 4.47, up 87 basis points.
Mhm.
So while the short-term rates went down 75 basis points, the long-term rate went up. And what's
Mhm.
for causing that? Could it be that the market is perceiving that there may be greater opportunities for inflation going forward? Could it be, some what we refer to as animal spirits in the market that are beginning to get people thinking that there could be more robust activity in the economy that could cause the demand for money to increase, and so therefore you would see those rates going up. What's going on with that? We don't know yet, but I would say that there's certainly elements that we have to be concerned about. And so while the Fed has begun cutting rates because they believe that inflation is at least temporarily under control, that I'm not necessarily sure that we can go that far that fast. Um, what everyone is concerned about, everyone who's been following this, and if you've been listening in our broadcast for the last few months, we've been talking about the fact that the Federal Reserve is afraid. They're deeply fearful of repeating the mistakes made back in the 1970s. Because in the 1970s, you had a Federal Reserve that was led by a gentleman by the name of Arthur Burns. And Arthur Burns um, was the Fed chairman at a time that we first began to deal with issues such as the Arab oil embargo. And we started seeing runaway inflation. And we'd see periods of great inflation, and inflation would collapse. And then it'd pick up again. And every time the Fed would see action like that, they would react. They would raise rates when inflation was high, they'd cut rates when inflation seemed to be going. And instead of having a policy direction, they had kind of a ping pong approach. And by the time we got to the end of the 1970s, the Fed was so completely confused about what's going on, and our economy was in such a wreck. It was a train wreck. We actually even created a whole term of called stagflation,
Mhm.
where you had high inflation, but you had stagnant growth, and that led to an economic malaise that really undermined and led to the catastrophic defeat that Jimmy Carter had to Ronald Reagan in 1980. So
Mhm.
no one wants to go back to that point. And the Federal Reserve had held rates higher for a much longer time period because they wanted to ensure that all the embers of inflation had been exhausted, had been extinguished. But now, even 2 months after the Fed has begun cutting rates, thinking that it was safe to go back into the water again, then we're beginning to see evidence that maybe they may be moving a little too fast and they may need to slow the process down. I'm not expecting the Fed to begin raising rates anytime soon. But I do think as we get into the first part of next year, we may go through a period of a pause. And it may not be until March or April before we see that next rate cut. Now we do know that the Federal Reserve is trying to bring interest rates down to what they call their neutral zone. Right now, the Fed funds rate is approximately 4.75%. And we believe that they're eventually going to cut back down to somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. But the time limit and the time period they take to do that is going to be critical. If they go too fast, then there's the risk of reigniting inflation. If they go too slow, then you're looking at a real cost of money that is substantially higher than where the market needs for it to be. And that creates a risk of recession. And so, that's why you're looking at such a balancing act for the economy, for the markets, for what's been going on. And certainly, we've just seen in the last 2 months, again, impacting your viewers, where mortgage rates are back up to around 6.8% on a national level. They were down in the 6.375 range. And so, while I do believe that rates are going to drop over the next year or so, that rate of decline is certainly going to be much slower as the Federal Reserve tries to thread that needle, of cutting at the appropriate rate. It's the old Goldilocks theory, not too slow, because if you go too slow, you risk recession. Not too fast, you risk inflation. So got to go just right. And so the question is, can the Federal Reserve thread that needle? Can they be just right in doing that? And so we'll be watching that very, very closely. Another thing we'll be watching as a result of this election is a whole new agency. Trump has already talked about the fact that he may be eliminating the Department of Education. And we'll see how that goes because you've got to get 60 votes in the Senate to be able to make that happen. And right now he's only at
Wow.
53. And so it's highly unlikely he can get this done, but he certainly could begin starving the Department of Education by reducing its funding or redirecting more to the states. So we'll see how that plays out. But there is another new agency that's been created, and so and to quote like an old cowboy, it's not get along little doggy, but it's what's going to happen with the Doji, the Doji agency, the Department of Government Efficiency. And here we go. It's Elon Musk. It's Vivek Ramaswamy. And they're leading the panel to go out there and say, where can they find cuts to bring this incredible amount of government overspending under control? I mean, for the past 2 years, we've had government deficits that are over 6% of GDP, over $2 trillion. Think about it. Just a few years ago, federal government spending was about $4 trillion a year. Now it's nearly 7. 4
Wow.
years ago, government debt in this country was $20 trillion. It took 183 years to build up $20 trillion of debt. It took 4 more to take us to 36 trillion. And how did that happen? The government got addicted to spending during COVID and they never stopped. And why did all this inflation occur? It occurred because the government printed money. They printed far more money than we needed. We saw the money supply increase by 43% in 18 months. And so it goes back to economic 101. When you have too many dollars chasing too few goods and services, prices go higher. And so we saw the inflation. Well, now here comes Elon, here comes Vivek, and now they're going to try to wrestle that budget deficit and bring it down. And so how are they going to do it? And so the concern was, oh my gosh, if they cut $1 trillion out of the budget, then it's going to throw the economy into recession. And it very well could if they did it all at once. Which they probably won't. See, one of the things that we talked about on our call is this whole concept of this guy by the name of John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was an incredible economist back in the 1930s and 40s, and he had this basic mindset that whenever there's a problem, the government shall come to the solution. And that the way that we solve this problem is for the government to spend more money. And by the government spending more money, it would stimulate the economy and everything would be great. And in fact, they said that the two worst things that could happen in times of chaos or in times of crisis would be for the government to cut spending or for people to save money. That they believe that people should not be saving money, that they should be spending it, always keeping that money in motion. So Keynesian economic theory has been a very, very wonderful partner of the Democratic Party for the past 4 years, because they have certainly spent money like drunken sailors. But that may be an indictment of drunken sailors because even they have to stop spending money when they run out. The government just prints more. And so in this situation, then even Keynes understood that you don't continue to spend money when you don't have that crisis, when you don't have that major recession, when you don't have that war that you got to prosecute. And so what we did was, for the first time in American history, that we've had 1 year, let alone two, that you had a deficit of over $2 trillion, over 6% of GDP that we ran. Unsustainable, and the reason why we have the level of debt that we do. When a government spends more money than they bring in, then it has to be paid for by issuing debt. And so in that debt means that we've got to pay interest on that debt. If somebody borrows money from us, or you borrow money from someone, I should say, then we have to pay that money back in theory. We never do, but we have to pay them interest on that. And so next year, in 2025 fiscal year, we're going to spend more money paying interest on the national debt than we will on defense spending. And no country in the history of modern society has ever done that and continued that and survived. So it's unsustainable. So what will Vivek and Elon be doing? Then they're going to be kind of challenging that old movie a few years ago, Dave. I don't know if you saw that movie, Dave, but Kevin Kline, great movie. He effectively was impersonating the president, and he brought his buddy in, Charles Grodin, who was a CPA, to balance the budget. And so Charles Grodin's dead, but here's Elon Musk, here's Vivek Ramaswamy, and they're going to be messing in all these guys' lives. And it should be great theater, if nothing else. So we'll be watching that. I don't anticipate that it'll be immediate cuts. It always tends to be things over an 8 or 10 year time period. But think about it. If we could just get this government to stop increasing spending, just keep spending at a hard cap. Now remember, the US government is the only place on the planet that if you cut the increase, if you reduce the amount of increase, they consider it to be a cut. So, so actually just holding the line and not spending any more money is something you never even considered. But if you did that, then within 7 to 8 years, because of the growth of our economy, we'd have a balanced budget. And so, but we've got to find a way to reduce the size and the impact of government on our lives. Right now, state, local, and federal government spending represents literally 47% of our economy. And it's hard to grow something. It's hard to grow your economy when 47% of anything you do creates nothing, builds nothing, grows nothing. It just redistributes. So we're looking at a sea change in terms of the philosophy of government and the impact it can have on our economy and our markets. And other than that, I have no opinion.
Just like that. Oh my goodness, David, thank you so much for all that update. My goodness. Tell me, as you've reflected on just all kinds of things, tariffs, inflation, interest rates affecting Canada, because our Canadian listeners remembers in the first term of Donald Trump's presidency, the first thing he did was put a tariff on Canadian lumber coming into the US, and it really impacted the Canadian side and the Canadian economy and all the lumber mills, especially along the border. There's then, of course, there's the issue of the oil pipeline, and his pick for Department of Interior is very interesting. So, what scares you the most from where you sit, David? And all of what you just said, what scares you the most?
I think the thing that scares me the most is we have a history in this country of governments coming in with big promises, big ideas, and doing nothing.
Yeah.
Business as usual cannot continue. Donald Trump has a Republican majority, a workable majority in the Senate, and a narrow majority in the House.
Mhm.
He's been given a political mandate, both in the Electoral College and in the popular vote, to
Mhm.
pursue change. But I've seen many, many times in the past where Democrats or Republicans will come in and have full control of the government and squander the opportunity. We have major issues in this country that must be addressed. We have Social Security, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid that are all on track to go bankrupt in 8 years.
Yeah.
If we think about the chaos that occurred around the horrible events that happened on January 6, 2001, and we think about that effectively an attack on the citadel of our democracy, our American capital, and the angry mob that did that. Think about the concept of a country where 60% of your retirees are solely dependent on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, have no other source of income. And if
Wow.
those things go bankrupt, then their checks don't completely disappear. But by law, there's a 17% reduction in their paychecks, in their checks from Social Security. Most of these people, that would mean the difference between eating,
Right.
between paying for the utilities,
Right.
paying for basic health care. This is a level of crisis that could cause the entire fabric of our nation to unravel.
Mhm.
And so, the fact that we have, again, unsustainable spending, the fact that we have, a mushrooming level of national debt, the fact that we have a government that it feels like the blob that consumed Cleveland, that keeps getting larger and larger and larger. We need change. We need for this government to come in there and begin to take control of the situation and begin to actually act upon this mandate and to reduce the size of government, to bring fiscal integrity in here, to address, and put in place a solution to ensure that the fabric of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid will continue to be funded. Because unfortunately, an awful lot of people in this country and in Canada and in Mexico did not do what a lot of your investors have done, and that is going out there and find ways to supplement their income, to find ways to build sustainable wealth. And so therefore they're solely dependent on the government handout and or Social Security, which is not a government handout, it is the money that they saved. But Social Security was never designed to be their sole source of income. I've been doing workshops and public speaking for 40 years about the whole idea of financial planning. And the whole idea was that a retirement, a future financial security is going to be built on a three-legged stool, on personal savings, on government subsidies, and on pension benefits. But we know that 40 years ago, 90% of the corporations in America, the Fortune 500 companies, offered a pension benefit. Today, virtually none do. We know that personal savings, which was over 7% before COVID, that now has almost evaporated. We've seen a resilient consumer that has kept us out of recession for the past 4 years, but at what cost? Once again, the credit card delinquencies are growing. And so as we look at, Black Friday coming up here in a couple of weeks, will we continue to see that robustness in terms of consumer spending? I think we will this year because I think those animal spirits are coming back. We're seeing a lot of activity where people who had put off that travel, put off those investments are coming in. But the question is, how much ammunition, is left in the, in the barrel for our consumers? We're getting
Mm.
close. We need, to do things that are necessary to bring stability back into the economy. And so it starts with, making the government smaller, making the government less a part, where it's the sole answer for every question. We need, to rebuild balance in our economy. And because if we're going to move to a completely socialist economy, fine. I disagree with that, but you've got to restore balance because we can't continue to live, in the way that we are now, in an unsustainable imbalance of spending versus revenue. And so that's my biggest fear. And because I do believe that while the consumer has kept us afloat, then I think that it's like a placebo. It's like a shot. It's like a sugar pill. But at some point, then that is going to run out. And the only way to grow this economy is to have that exponential growth, that catalyst for growth that I think is out there. But we've got to quit and get a move away from this mindset that the government is the answer to all of our questions.
Gotcha. David, thank you so much. If a listener is interested in contacting you in one of your variety of businesses that you have, how do they get a hold of you? How do they learn more on your weekly calls and podcasts and everything?
Probably the easiest thing to do is just to go to our website at www.picklerwealthadvisors.com. That's Pickler, Pickler, Wealth Advisors. And as our podcast says, it's advisors with an O, not an E.
Not an E. No,
And
I listen.
but picklerwealthadvisors.com, check us out. You can find all of our content. You can find our Bullcast podcast, which Cameron and Court and Katie do an amazing job. I think they're on episode 233. Haven't missed a week in over 4.5 years. You've got my Bull Talk that I do every Thursday afternoon. You can also, anyone can tune in, call in for that. We've got our Bull TV. Just recorded our 42nd edition of that. We do it on a monthly basis, which is fun. We've got all kinds of content that's out there. They can go check out the website, check out the information about our law firm, our accounting firm, Pickler Wealth Advisors, or the education outreach we have with the American Pillars Education Foundation. And if they're really bored, then they go to Amazon.com and buy my book. At Pillars of Purpose, baby.
Pillars of Purpose. I love it. No, great book. I enjoyed it. And I really am pleased at the pop twist with Bullcast podcast because it's always some kind of fun. It's a financial based topic, but then the first thing that Katie does is throw in a fun list of something about movies or commercials, or it's always just a fun twist, and there's a lesson in there, and just literally I tune in every week, which I don't normally get hooked like that, but I mean, I know the Pickler team, and I really just enjoy the content, and we listen to everything. Between Mike and I, we listen to everything. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, you are
Appreciate it.
so welcome.
Oh,
Hey,
it's
look,
great.
love you, Jen. You are awesome. And keep listening to this lady. She's awesome.
Beautiful. Before we depart, any parting thoughts?
You know what? Change is inevitable. And I do hope that the president-elect chooses this opportunity. But listen, each and every one of us needs to understand that as citizens, whether we're of Canada, of the U.S., wherever it is, engaged citizenship is the single most important thing that we all need to continue to pursue. And if you have the opportunity through voting, the opportunity through public service, you have the opportunity just through your own family, get involved, stay involved, and just understand that we live in one of the greatest places in the world. Whether in Canada or the U.S., we have a level of freedom that the rest of the world envies. And whether it's participating in our financial markets and the real estate markets or whatever, the whole idea of private property, of ownership, of respect for the rights that we have. There's such amazing things we have to do. So just relish in every day. Rejoice in the opportunities we have each and every day, because every day there's an opportunity to do something great, and just keep doing it.
Love it. Love it. David, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Take care.